Thank you, Mrs. President. Thank you, cher Petra. Mesdames et messieurs les députés.
Ladies and gentlemen, members, I will speak French. So let me thank you very warmly for this invitation to speak in your committee. I am happy to be here once again. I was with you just a month or so ago. As you have said, Madam Chair, we're entering a new phase of this crisis where we're coming out of lockdown. We're looking at restarting the European economy. We want something that is green, digital, resilient, autonomous. And I'd like to mention a number of different elements related to this crisis. First, starting with the single market. This is key. We need to do everything we can to ensure we have a single market which is properly functioning. As I've often said before, we cannot have any kind of export bans within our single market or any kind of restrictions in terms of the free circulation of goods and services. It was true before the crisis, and I think it's even more important now. The single market is a very important tool of European solidarity. The virus, of course, does not stop at borders, so our response to this crisis has to be based on a spirit of European solidarity. It is absolutely key for us to ensure access to medication and to protective equipment, and also to safeguard our industrial supply chains. It's true that the initial reflex of a number of member states at the beginning of the crisis was to close their borders, to look inwards, which was counterproductive. I acted immediately to try and remove these barriers. Over the last 2 months, I have worked with 18 different member states, often at a ministerial level, looking at around 30 different restrictive measures. Those restrictions, which are the most problematic on personal protective equipment, have been lifted now. Nevertheless, I am still concerned by more recent measures introduced by member states on foodstuffs or medication. I said this at the last Competitiveness Council on Friday, just a couple of days ago, that this is not acceptable and the Commission will not hesitate to act. Just last week, we launched a new procedure, and we will have a zero-tolerance policy on these types of protectionist measures. There is no room for this within our single market. I will move on now to resilience and to autonomy. And this is the second big aspect to this crisis that we need to look at. This crisis has shown that some of our supply chains are very much dependent on suppliers from outside of the EU. Globalization has, of course, led to a number of economic advantages, but it has also shown that it can be a risk factor in emergency situations. We saw this at the beginning of the crisis. There was the risk of a lack of masks, gowns, respirators. So we need to look at certain strategic areas where we need to have a capacity to produce within Europe. We need to look at critical technology and infrastructure, critical supplies such as raw materials, active ingredients in pharmaceutical products, and this also applies to green technologies. This is an area where Europe needs to take leadership at a global level. So we need a stronger Europe, a more resilient Europe, and this is very important to make the digital transition and green transition that we're experiencing. This is not saying that we need to cut ourselves off to the rest of the world, but we need to make sure we have the sufficient needs to achieve strategic autonomy. It's about having a choice. It's about our industries making choices in terms of relocalization. It's not about bringing everything back to Europe. That would simply not be realistic, and it would be counterproductive. Before the crisis, this phenomenon was already ongoing. We talked about internalization in industries, the environmental costs, the issues in terms of the integration of digital services. And in fact, on these aspects, as many others, the crisis has just accelerated the tendencies we'd seen already in terms of our industrial strategy. Now, more specifically in terms of our restart plan, we're looking at having specific intervention mechanisms as fund that can really protect our value chains and help with the reindustrialization of Europe, especially in those areas where we've lost capacity in terms of industry or technology. And then thirdly, of course, we've seen the importance of digital technologies. I think everyone has seen the importance of digital services, this distance communication, when so many people are in lockdown now. We have member states that are developing tracking and tracing apps, for example. So I think there are four important aspects which are necessary for having our economy start again. We need better connectivity. We need a strengthened data economy, a strong industrial presence when it comes to the technology, and better cybersecurity. So what we need is to accelerate the deployment of 5G resources. We need a legislative framework as soon as possible in terms of governance when it comes to data, data sharing, creating common data spaces, working on a number of key technologies, quantum, blockchain, microprocessors, semiconductors, for example, again, to ensure technological autonomy, and then revising the legislative framework on cyber security. The final element that I wanted to touch on is that of European solidarity. This is not something which is optional. This is a necessity. We want to have this plan to restart our economy, something at a European level. It is key, and we saw this in the European Parliament resolution last week. We're talking about the integrity of the single market. That's key for having the right fair conditions in place for our single market in terms of global competition. At a global level, we will not be able to come out of this crisis if we don't stick together. We don't want to be disadvantaged compared to American companies or Chinese companies who have massive state aid. So we have to be extremely vigilant here. When it comes to the single market, we have to look very carefully at the issue of state aid. There are certain countries in the EU that have a much greater capacity to provide support to their economy and their industry, and other countries don't have that capacity. So we need to have a symmetric, balanced response. Otherwise, we'll have the fragmentation of the single market and an imbalance in our industrial change. So what we need is a new method to overcome these national divisions and to have a really European approach. And this is something which is based around industrial ecosystems within Europe. This can cover value chains at an industrial level, going from large companies all the way down to SMEs and startups, training centres, research centres, associations of suppliers that may operate transnationally. We have identified 14 ecosystems. You can see those there in the picture, portrayed in the shape of a daisy. So we're talking about the industry, culture, health, many different types of industry. So I think this allows us to better understand the situation, what our needs are in terms of industry. I think it is very important for us to take this perspective when we look at restarting our economy. The Commission is trying to respond to the calls of the European Council to carry out this analysis in terms of the ecosystems. What we need to have a really targeted response. We have carried out this analysis now, so we have an ambitious restart plan for Europe, working together with our partners to put in place support plans, whether it's indirect or direct support, and this adds up to around 10% of GDP. Ladies and gentlemen, beyond just this healthcare emergency, which is of course our main priority, we have seen that this crisis is accelerating changes around the world, the way we live, the way we produce in terms of digitalization and our impact on the resources and this planet. The challenges are huge. As Jean Monnet said, we don't accept change unless it's a necessity, and we only have this type of necessity in a crisis. We have a collective responsibility here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Breton, for your opening statement. We will have 2 rounds of questions, as